Is it really the case that a broken window would have the same effect in an affluent part of town compared to a poor part of town? Let's talk more about broken windows, and in particular I want to talk about the importance of social context for broken window theory.
Oh, I'm not posh, I love kebabs!
There's one study that I find very fascinating in this regard. It's a study by Koichnik and Wollbrink. They replicate some experience from Kaiser and others, but then they add this dimension of social context to it. And their thinking starts from a rational choice model of crime. And that really goes back to Gary Becker, who used rational choice theory, he's like an economist, to explain things that economists would have not explained before. And one thing that Gary Becker looks at is how rational is it to commit crime. According to this model, it is rational for individuals to break a rule as long as the chance of punishment is small compared to the potential gain. So basically, there's a cost-benefit analysis, so to speak. Not to say that criminals do that, oftentimes they are not the most rational beings, but according to this model, what you would do is when you see a neighborhood that is run down or with lots of litter onto the floor or lots of broken windows, you would think that, hang on, not only do people not seem to care, but apparently people don't get sanctioned for doing that either. Now, they don't get punished for throwing in a window or littering onto the floor. Because if they would, you wouldn't observe that much littering or graffiti or disorder in this particular case. So what you see is actually a cue that you can take for what you think the expected costs for doing something are. And if you follow this argument for a moment, it would be the case that individuals look for cues. They look for signs on what is the level of social control here in this neighborhood where I am at that moment. And a neighborhood highly endowed with social capital should exhibit a stronger level of social control. The idea really is that when you are in a shiny neighborhood, that kind of gives you the sense that, okay, people really seem to care about, for example, litter onto the floor, and people seem to get sanctioned for doing it because you don't observe people doing it. So you better don't, because this neighborhood is controlled.
Police, put your hands up. Put them over your head.
But there's another thing. And in neighborhoods that are, let's say, highly endowed with social capital, so neighborhoods that are very rich, very shiny, very nice, things are very well kept. In these neighborhoods, it is also more salient when you observe disorder, because it really sticks out.
There's a kind of a preconception that this university's got a lot of posh people in it.
I'm not posh, I love kebabs!
So I live in a crappy neighborhood, and the odd piece of rubbish is on the floor all the time, and nobody seems to care. But when you are in a fancy neighborhood, having some rubbish on the floor really sticks out. It is something unusual. It is really a clear sign that a norm is being broken. While in my neighborhood, it is not such a sign anymore, because the norm is broken all the time anyway.
Oh, I love trash. Anything dirty or dingy or dusty.
So Koichnik and Wollbrink, and this is their innovation, they say that there is an interaction, that the social capital at a place matters for how pronounced the spreading of disorder happens. And the argument leads to the following hypothesis, that the spreading of disorder should be more pronounced in neighborhoods with high social capital. So basically, in a nice, shiny, fancy neighborhood where things are under control, having disorder really breaks that. more than in a crappy neighborhood where you have graffiti at the wall all the time and litter on the floor. So having an extra piece of disorder isn't something that breaks the norms that obviously here. So Kreutzig and Bollbring, they went out and they replicated one of the Kaiser studies. Essentially, they attached, again, like flyers to bikes. In this case, they were bikes parked outside of dormitories in Munich. And they did that, looked at how many people throw the flyer onto the floor. And then they went along and placed rubbish sacks next to those bikes. Now that's the treatment condition. Then they looked again at how many people throw the flyer onto the floor. But they didn't just stop there. So they also went and repeated these experiments in different parts of town. In neighborhoods with high social capital and in neighborhoods with low social capital. We can talk about how they measured social capital, just read the paper about that. But just to give you a brief idea, they asked people in these dormitories with the survey different kinds of questions. For example, how frequent do they have shared activities like common cooking or common sports or partying? Or what is the depth of the contact that people have with others? Or what is the perceived cohesion in that dormitory? And here we have the design. They went to low social capital dormitories and to high social capital dormitories. And in both cases, they attached flyers to these bikes and looked at how many people throw it onto the floor. And that's the control condition, like just how many people throw these flyers onto the floor. And then in both cases, in the low and in the high social capital dormitory, they went and put those rubbish sacks next to the bikes. And that's the treatment. So and then they looked again at how many people throw the flyer onto the floor. And they didn't just compare the before and after situation, the control with the treatment, but they compared this difference between the control and the treatment in the low social capital dormitory compared with the high social capital dormitory. So if social capital would not matter at all, well, these differences, they should be the same. But in the case social capital does matter, these differences should be different. And this is the finding that they had, which is quite interesting. First of all, let's just compare the gray bars, which is the treatment, which is where the rubbish sack was placed next to those bikes with the flyers, with the white bars. And what you see is that in both cases, both in the low and in the high social capital dormitories, in the treatment condition, more people throw the flyers onto the floor. So this is a replication of the Kaiser study. When people see already rubbish on the floor, they're more likely to throw this flyer onto the floor. But now it gets interesting because now we can compare those differences between treatment control for the low and the high social capital dormitories. And what we observe here is that you see, first of all, in the low social capital dormitories, there's much more littering to begin with. That's interesting by itself. But then also in the low social capital dormitories, the treatment, the rubbish sack next to the bikes, increases it by around 15%, while it increases it by 24% in the high social capital context. So this rubbish sack makes a bigger difference in the high social capital dormitories. They went and repeated this experiment in a different context. They looked at jaywalking, like crossing the pedestrian light when it's red. So the target norm was jaywalking. And as a context norm, again, they used a rubbish sack. So they placed a rubbish sack next to traffic lights. So what you see here is the same traffic light. And you have like the first scenario, this would be the order condition. You see it's clean, there's nothing there. Traffic light is red, but there's nothing there. And then they have the disorder condition. It's the same traffic light, it's red, but now there's a rubbish sack lying next to it. And you see, this is the same idea as in the Kaiser et al. Study. This would be a replication of it to see whether people are more likely to jaywalk in the disorder compared to the order condition. But they didn't just stop there. So they went further and they went to different pedestrian traffic lights in different parts of Munich, where they know some parts are more affluent than others. So there's So here we have the design, again, like a low social capital neighborhood and a high social capital neighborhood. They measured that in some ways, and they looked at how many people jaywalk, how many people walk over the traffic light when it's red. And again, if social capital would not matter, these differences between treatment and control should be the same in both low and high social capital neighborhoods. And this is the result that they get. So again, it's pretty striking. First of all, we observe in both cases that the gray bars are higher than the white bars, meaning when there is a rubbish sack next to that traffic light, more people that have the opportunity to jaywalk actually do jaywalk. But now let's look at the differences between low and high social capital neighborhood. And here you see that the treatment, this rubbish sack, increases the number of people that jaywalk by 13%. But in the high social capital neighborhood, it increases it by much more. So you see the differences, they are not the same. Well, actually they are different, meaning that social capital seems to matter for how disorder spreads when it spreads. To summarize this so far, so social context matters for how people react to minor norm violations, and social cues seem to be taken as signs or signals for social control. And there are these differences between high and low social capital neighborhoods. Like signs of disorder are more salient in neighborhoods with high social capital. It's a very interesting study. I really like it. But there's one thing when I read it that I didn't like. And that was this assumption that social capital does something. Now, we know the ecological fallacy. It's not the neighborhood that does something. It's still individuals that do something. So I thought, can we replicate that and really look at individuals? And that's what I did with a couple of students. I went out and I replicated some of the broken window theory experience at the campus of UCD. So a year ago, I went and I literally attached flyers to bikes at UCD. And so what we did is something very similar. So I was very proudly, I came up with these flyers. We wish you a happy holidays. And we attached those flyers to bikes in front of the library at UCD. So here we have the setup, we have the order condition. You see the flyers attached to the bikes. And on the other side, you see the disorder condition. So in the disorder condition, we deliberately put some flyers onto the floor to begin with. While in the order condition, we always made sure that we picked up the flyers when somebody threw it onto the floor. And then we were interested in how many people throw the flyers onto the floor. And we also repeated this experiment with cars parked on the parking lot at UCD. And later on, we also went to a shopping center, a bit like in the Kaiser study, and also attached flyers to the windshield wipers of those cars. And again, we kind of, in the order condition, everything was clean. In the disorder condition, we used some other flyers and distributed them on the floor around those cars. And these were our findings. So basically, we really could replicate those studies before, Kaiser et al., but also Koichnik and Wolbring. In the order condition, in the bike case, 90% of the people that came and picked up their bike threw the flyer onto the floor. While in the disorder condition, where lots of flyers were already on the floor because we put them there, there's over 70% of the people threw the flyer onto the floor. And the same in the context of the cars. In the order condition, 31% of the people threw the flyer onto the floor. But in the disorder condition, where we had put lots of flyers onto the floor already, again, it was many more people, up to 67% of the people that threw the flyers onto the floor. It's pretty cool, and I was really excited that we could replicate those earlier studies. But we didn't stop there. Now, when you look at this flyer again, you see there is an address underneath it. And what we did do, we had different addresses for different bikes. So we could match that flyer that ended up on the floor to the bike or to the car that it was coming from. And then what we also did when we put those flyers onto the bikes or onto the cars, we rated those bikes and cars, and we gave it a score for how fancy a bike or how fancy a car is it. In the case of Ireland, it's even more interesting because based on the license plate, you can tell when a car was registered. So we collected that information and then we're able to say whether people that have crappy bikes litter more than people that have shiny bikes. And our results show that there is a difference between the order and the disorder condition. So in the disorder condition, more people litter. But that difference between the disorder and the order condition seems to be getting smaller when people have high quality bikes. For cars, we find that the differences between disorder and order condition seem to remain the same, but the same phenomena again, that in the disorder condition, people with low quality cars litter more than people with high quality cars. Anyway, we're still writing up this piece of research, and I conducted that with a couple of students of mine. But to summarize, it shows that social context matters for broken window theory. It seems to play out differently in different neighborhoods. That's what the Koichnik and Wolbring paper showed. But my own study seems to show that it goes even beyond that. The kind of individual matters. Is it an individual that is more affluent or less affluent? So according to my study, the quality of bikes and cars matters for how people react to the spreading of disorder. So it's not just social context that matters, but individual characteristics as well. And so much about broken window theory. Take care.